The Ukrainian war has progressed to a state of tug-of-war, and neither side has made significant progress. The main Russian troops have been decimated on a large scale. The Russian army has changed its strategy. Rather than a quick war, it has adopted a strategy of encirclement by erosion, and is slowly approaching Kyiv by virtue of its huge volume. To be objective, the situation in Kyiv isn't optimistic despite a lot of videos and information on social media showing Russian troops being hit, vehicles and aircraft being destroyed, and a few Russian troops being captured. The situation in Kyiv is like a raging bear stuck outside one's living room door. Although the person has managed to stab it in the side, or the bear has lost a lot of blood and may have even lost part of its toes or paws, it's still using its huge body and brute strength to slowly squeeze through the door and is eager to get revenge after breaking in. A video that has been making rounds on social media shows a Russian captive confirming that the Russian army has reinstated the firing squad system used in the Soviet era, where special supervisors are set up to execute, on the spot, those who try to escape or disobey orders. That's why the situation in Kyiv isn't optimistic even when the press is showing a promising picture of the Ukrainian army. The main battlefield is largely at a standstill. The other fronts are heating up, escalating what was once a one-on-one contest into a situation where more countries could potentially be involved. This is mainly reflected in several very delicate events. The Russian army has attacked the border of Ukraine and Poland, and the risk of escalating the war has increased. First of all, on March 13th, a military facility called International Peace and Security Center in Yavoriv, a town about 40 kilometers northwest of Lviv in western Ukraine, was attacked by 8 Russian missiles. According to the Russian Defense Ministry, the attack targeted foreign mercenaries at the military base, and at least 180 mercenaries were eliminated.
Утром 13 марта высокоточным оружием большой дальности нанесен удар по учебным центрам Вооруженных сил Украины, населенном пункте Старичи и на военном полигоне Яворовский. На данных объектах киевским режимом были развернуты пункт подготовки и боевого слаживания иностранных наемников перед отправкой в районы боевых действий против российских военнослужащих, а также база хранения поступающего от зарубежных стран вооружения и военной техники. В результате удара уничтожены до 180 иностранных наемников и крупная партия иностранного вооружения. Уничтожение прибывших на территорию Украины иностранных наемников будет продолжено.
But local military administration in Ukraine said the attack killed 35 people and injured 134 others, none of whom were foreign nationals.
While there are concerns about whether international volunteers were killed or injured, the real touchy point of the attack is that the military base is located very close to Poland's border. It's less than 15 kilometers away. Before the outbreak of war, U.S. military personnel trained Ukrainian troops there, and NATO exercises were conducted there too.
After the outbreak of the war, this place has been a transit point for many refugees going to Poland and other neighboring countries, as well as a landing place for Ukrainians who have taken refuge in the country. Therefore, this is the first time that a Russian missile attack has hit a place that is so close to NATO countries and may have hurt people from other countries, so it certainly sends a strong warning signal. NATO's response was also very crisp. The British Secretary of State for Health said, "We have made it very clear to the Russians that even if a single Russian towcap steps into NATO territory, then it will be considered an act of war." In reality, as early as 5 days ago, on March 8th, the US had already delivered and deployed 2 Patriot missile defense systems to Poland. That is to say, as Russia begins to launch attacks on western Ukraine near Poland, the risk of a direct conflict between Russian forces and NATO is on the rise. The second disturbing incident came last Saturday, March 13th, when Iran fired at least 12 missiles at the northern Iraqi city of Erbil, hitting the vicinity of the US consulate there. The Iranians said it was in retaliation for the killing of 2 members of the Revolutionary Guard and a strike on an Israeli spy center. Although no casualties were reported in the attack, Iran's action at this sensitive time gives the impression that it was a deliberate attempt to take advantage of the situation. In other words, even if such an act doesn't result in casualties, it could lead to controversy and instability, further complicating the situation. Russia asks China to provide military aid. US issues stern warning. The third and more serious incident is directly related to the other protagonist of this war, the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP. A couple days ago, the Financial Times broke the news that according to US government officials, the Russians have been asking for more military equipment and other assistance from the CCP since the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The New York Times also reported on this. A number of other media outlets have since followed up on the story, including a CNN report that included some details that the series of Russian requests for assistance involved drones and a significant amount of economic assistance. Both Russian and Chinese officials have routinely denied this information. It's no secret that Russia hopes to ride out the economic sanctions with the help of the CCP. The Russian finance minister said publicly on March 13th that nearly half of Russia's gold and foreign exchange reserves had been frozen because of the sanctions, but that a portion of Russia's gold and foreign exchange reserves are denominated in the renminbi.
And of course,
while the West is stepping up pressure on the CCP to limit bilateral trade with Russia and restrict Russia's use of its RMB reserves, Russia wants China to not only maintain its current level of cooperation, but to increase it. Moreover, on March 11th, the Russian Minister of Transport also publicly asked the CCP for aircraft parts, while the day before, on March 10th, as we know, Russia itself confirmed the CCP's refusal to supply aircraft parts to Russian airlines. At about the same time, the US also issued a public warning to the CCP. US National Security Advisor Sullivan told the US media that the White House is closely monitoring whether the CCP is providing material or economic support to Russia, and that Beijing will definitely face serious consequences if it helps Russia evade sanctions on the war in Ukraine.
We are watching very closely the extent to which the PRC, or any other country for that matter, provides any form of support, whether that's material support, whether that's economic support, whether that's financial support, to Russia. Any such support from anywhere in the world would be of great concern to us. It would be of course, the greatest concern if a country like the PRC were to be doing that. Here's the point. We've made very clear that any country that would seek to attempt to bail Russia out of this economic, financial morass will be met with consequences. We will ensure that no country is able to get away with such a thing.
The warning came as the National Security Council announced that Sullivan would meet with Chinese diplomat Yang Jiechi in Rome, Italy on March 14th for a high-level face-to-face meeting in which the Ukraine war and the US-China rivalry would be the main topics. The meeting was very low-key, and the US side stated in advance that there would be no press conference after to report on the meeting. The official statement from the White House after the meeting contains only 80-some words, mentioning only that the two sides had extensive discussions about the Russian war on Ukraine and emphasizing the importance of maintaining open channels of communication between the US and China. The watershed moment is coming. How will China spend the next 20 years? Although no substantial agreement was made, this meeting is actually very significant. The talks have in fact marked a watershed moment for two key issues. One is that the US has effectively urged the CCP to take a clear stand on the war between Russia and Ukraine. The other is that the relationship between the US and China may change substantially as a result. Let's first discuss the first watershed moment. As we have seen earlier, both the US and Russia are now openly calling out to the CCP, with one side asking for more aid to ease the sanctions and the other side asking for aid to be cut off and to join the sanctions. Clearly, both the US and Russia want the CCP to openly take sides, and they don't want the CCP to continue to pretend to be neutral. In the previous episode, we discussed that the CCP was actually an accomplice and partner in the Russian invasion of Ukraine all along. But now, the CCP is starting to soften its tone and trying to be vague as it sees that sanctions against Russia are much stronger than it anticipated. It fears that it might be dragged down by Russia.
中方在乌克兰问题上一直秉持客观公正立场。冲突发生以来，中 中方一直以实际行动致力于劝和促谈。中方的公正立场和建设性努力有目共睹，得到了国际社会，特别是广大发展中国家的理解和支持。
The CCP wants to preserve the room for making amends with the West. Putin sees it clearly and knows the easiest way to prevent the CCP from jumping ship is to publicly emphasize how the Russian-Chinese relationship is a relationship of true friends and to publicly ask the CCP for assistance. The Americans' call to the CCP has a dual purpose as well. One is to force the CCP to cut off the massive transfusion of blood to Russia and to create conditions for Ukraine to win the war. The other is to break up the fragile alliance between China and Russia.
So to be clear, did President Biden warn President Xi not to send any support to Russia?
I think he made clear what the implications and consequences would be if he did. That is laying out what the consequences would be. President Xi has to decide what he's going to do here.
And not just here, but is it fair to characterize that as a warning?
I would characterize it exactly as I said it.
And did President Biden and President Xi discuss the possibility of lifting sanctions and or tariffs as a way to get China?
This was not about carrots. This was about laying out what the implications and consequences would be.
Therefore, this is likely to be a watershed moment for Ukraine's war of defense. If the US and China showdown and the CCP is determined to support Putin, Ukraine would be in a very difficult situation. As NATO only provides support for single-armed weapons, Ukraine has almost no ability to move from defense to counterattack. It might eventually turn into an Afghanistan where the war would become long-term and guerrilla, and it might take many years to recover its homeland. If the CCP is forced to comply with the international sanctions ban due to its own interests, Putin would lose the huge backup and have to consider how to withdraw his troops as soon as possible. The second watershed moment is directly related to the relationship between China and the US and the fate of the Chinese people for the next 20 or even 30 years. What kind of life the Chinese people will lead and whether the Chinese people could continue to be connected to the global community may be decided in these few days. Why is that? The biggest strategic mistake by the US and NATO is that they have mistakenly defined the structural confrontation between the US and China as a competitive relationship, and have instead elevated the US-Russian competition to a confrontational relationship. Russia could have remained outside the confrontation between the US and China, but instead it was pushed out and ended up forming a temporary strategic alliance with the CCP. If the CCP sides with Russia, it would help the international community lose its illusions about the CCP, and the Sino-US relationship would move towards confrontation in the real sense. China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea would move towards a new Cold War confrontation with the alliance of democratic countries. They would be excluded from the globalization system and start an internal cycle among themselves. To put it bluntly, China would have to go back to the era when everyone learned Russian. And if the CCP finally participates in the international sanctions against Russia, it would continue its presence in the globalized economy, but it pays the price of losing its friendship with Russia. While dealing with the competition from the US and Europe, the CCP would also have to be on guard against the sick bear next to it, who has lost a lot of its strength but is now full of resentment. Either way, it will be a difficult choice for the CCP and constitute a major crisis for it. This is the result of the CCP's own greed to seek global domination, which has created this dilemma today. The CCP's ideological roots make it impossible to integrate into the democratic camp globally, yet it can no longer do without the nourishment from interacting with democratic societies. This ultimate contradiction is the fundamental reason why the CCP fails to embrace democracy.